It's me again, the boy in his Bible. And this is my continued talk on the overview of the Bible. We've already seen that Genesis gives us the birth or the conception of a new nation in Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Judah. We've seen the birth of that nation from captivity to go to the promised land that was given to Abraham 500 years earlier or thereabout. We've seen how there was an educational process for holy living, for godly living, for correct living, to be the friends of God and to enjoy God and to know God and to be aware of God, to keep people close to God. And we've seen that not only do we have the law, but we have the priesthood doing their teaching ministry that was there. If you want to know the covenant of the house of Levi, which is the Aaron, you find it in the 2nd chapter of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. Very, very illuminating. We then see, in addition, the fact that there was a tabernacle, which I didn't mention in my first talk or talks. And the tabernacle wasn't to show that God's presence was for the Jews but nobody else. God's presence was everywhere. And it was just as much in their local tents as in the big tent that held the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. But what God was saying is, I want to be with you as a nation. I want to be your God, your life. I can remember after the First World War how more people in the war years went to church. The churches were always full. When the war was over, slowly they began not to be so full. A nation for God. And Israel was to be a nation for God, a light to the Gentiles. And that is what we have in the teaching of Leviticus. Numbers is their wilderness journeys, but it demonstrates that God was providing for them, even though they were in rebellion. Deuteronomy, 3 great sermons centered around the covenant he had with his people. A covenant that would help to direct them and help them in the promised land. Then we come to now the land of the Bible. So we've had the birth of the nation, but here's the land of the nation and the land of the Bible, as we call it, Israel. This Joshua, he has to overcome 2 major difficulties. One within his own people, and 2 with the people around in the land. They had, over the 500 years since the days of Abraham, many tribes had come in and they had practiced some awful things morally, even to the sacrificing of children. Can you believe that? In hoping that gods would somehow be persuaded to help them in this or that matter. And there is a war that we don't understand because we don't understand the culture any more than we understand the culture of the kings going out to the war. But it happened. It was part of the world that was there, a very violent world. And the idea of erecting this nation of Israel throughout was to demonstrate to all mankind that God can be with man. A man can be with God. And this was to be something that would be a light and a gift to the rest of the world. Sadly, it was not to be. The instructions that was given to them was very scarcely carried out. When you come then to Judges, you come to disintegration, moral disintegration amongst the 12 tribes. Still 12 tribes, sometimes working together, most times independent of each other. Powerful tribes, very powerful tribes, far larger internally. Of course they had problems with the Egyptians on the one side and the Assyrians on the other. But for a time, they were growing and developing, and life was becoming easy for them. But the rich was becoming richer and the poor was becoming less so. Haven't we heard of that many times in the Western world. And if we were able to share our resources as was intended, what goodness there would be in the world, righteousness and grace operating in the world. Righteousness and grace, both of them operating in the world. Judges is not a nice book. It's actually, we've got heroes like Samson. And we're glad to leave the book of Judges and come into the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is a most incredible book because it is concerned with the redemption of the land. And the people portrayed to us that's there are also significant. Ruth and Naomi and the other people. But this was the land. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer. To be able to give back a land that belonged to the mother-in-law of Ruth, and therefore Ruth and any children that would be born to them. And children was born. She did marry Boaz. It had to go through a ritual to do so, but she did marry Boaz, and children was born. And from that descent was King David. You see, David wasn't a total Jew. He was a Moabite as well as a Jew. And maybe there's some lessons there for us all when we want to try and develop our view of our relationships with humanity. And so we have the land. And we move from the land to the leaders. Indeed, Samuel's and Kings and Chronicles is about leadership. Leadership of Eli, followed by Samuel, who was a kind of a prophet, priest and a king in himself. You know, the people didn't like Samuel coming to visit them. He stood for something far greater than they were living. They was quite happy when he was in somebody else's village and not their village. An incredible man. An incredible man who had two sons who were not incredible. If they were incredible, it's because the people didn't want them to take over the role of Samuel. They were not good judges. They were selfish. So often that happens in life. The next generation don't follow the same generations before. And then we have suddenly one of the great characters of the Bible called Saul. He had some incredible virtues. Incredible virtues. Some virtues that was far better than the person who will become king after him, David. But he had a weakness, and that weakness was envy and jealousy. He knew that he was doing some things that he shouldn't have done. And he knew that the kingship was not going to stay in his house. And he knew that it would be transferred to David. And transferred to David he was. And David, for the first 20 years of his life, was the most incredible king the people ever known. Indeed, so much so, the people was known there afterwards as the son of David, or not the son of David, or not followed in the steps of his David. Even great children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on further down the line. But to David was given a promise. And the promise that was given to David, that one day there would come a ruler, that would be the perfect ruler, the prince of rulers. Now it would be the son of David. In other words, in those first 20 years, the character of David would be the character of this promised man. And how again and again and again the Jewish people would have looked for a new king to be like David, but it never happened until Jesus. And Jesus was the son of David, as well as the son of Abraham, as you open up your New Testament. From David came Solomon, and I'm afraid that the last 20 years of David's life had problems in the family and in decisions that he made. Committed adultery and premeditated murder. Awful, awful. And he was judged by God with it, and he had to find repentance and forgiveness. God is a redeeming God, always a redeeming God, if people want it. And Solomon started off with good ambitions, but ended up in a very sad situation. He was not good for the nation. He overtaxed the people. The taxation that he gave wasn't 10%. It was nearer 50%. Not too far off from what's taking place in the Western world, actually. But he used the taxes to build and build and build. And he built himself a gigantic palace. Then with the materials that his father had left him, he built the temple, the great symbol of religion. But when the time came for Solomon to say a prayer and a thank you, he said to God, God, you don't dwell in temples made with hand, but please be kind to us and come to us. That was the tone of his letter. I want to be like my father David. And Father and God in his grace has so often came in a flood, full of his glory. Sadly, we would see in the Old Testament the glory one day would leave. First the temple, then the city, then the nation. And it would take some 70 years before the presence of God would come back with his people. Following on from the days of Solomon, because of the way he was overbearing with the people in taxation and making them work as well to do things for his building projects, the nation was divided and the civil war going on. And that goes on for some time. And the largest part of the civil war was the north. Not Jerusalem and Benjamin and those areas and Judah, but the 10 tribes. They were the strong people. But one day, the leadership had failed so much that the power of Assyria came along and took city after city, village after village, town after town, until it was knocking on the doors of Jerusalem. And God intervenes using a prophet called Elijah. And that intervention takes place, and the Assyrians do not take Jerusalem. And Jerusalem would be secured for another 100 or so years. And they would get richer, more self-confident, and Babylon would come and take them in 3 stages. And then the kingdom of Israel will be away in another country. Some had gone to Egypt, some had gone to Babylon, some had gone to Assyria, and some had gone to other places. And it would take a miracle, a gigantic miracle, as great as the exodus from Egypt, to bring them back. But maybe that's part of the next overview. So what we have here is very simply, first we have the birth, we have the land, and now we have the leadership. And that helps us to understand an overview of the Bible. Thank you again. Hope to see you soon.